Hi, everybody. How are you tonight? Some weird background noises. I thought I got rid of the background noises. Oh, wait. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, how's the sound now? How's the sound now? I should have fixed it all. There we go. How's my sound now? Hello, everybody. Good to see you, Kay. Can anybody tell me if the sound problems are over? I'd appreciate it. Or do I need to tinker some more? Well, I hope you've all had a good day. We've had a good day here. It was a little cooler than it's been. Still awfully hot, but a little cooler. Is it still, do we have an echo here? Or still some weird background noises? Not sure what they might be. gee. I know what it was. It wasn't going through my microphone. It was going through system sound, even though I thought I'd taken it off system sound. No, not really. That should be the end of it, Steve. Is that right? Steve, have I got it now? Okay, then. I'm going to share the screen. Going back to too damn hot here in Northeast Ohio again tomorrow for the rest of the week. I hate that. Russ says, no echo or big noise here. Little sync difference between mouth movements, okay, and audio. Yeah, it's very hard to get rid of that, I think. But thanks, Russ. Steve says, sounds like a bunch of demons chattering. Still, Steve? The only sound source. God, it keeps going off. I keep setting it to my microphone, and it keeps going off. Okay, let me know as we go forward, because I think it's time to start. Okay, so this chapter is called Impact Assessment for Trade Policy, and I'll just go through it with you. Regardless of whether one thinks U.S. trade policy over the past 35 years has been beneficial or a disaster for the United States, it is hard to deny the proposition that trade policy and trade agreements have had any less impact on the U.S. economy than fiscal and monetary policy over that period. Certainly, the changes wrought by expanded trade with Mexico, Japan, and China have had a great impact on the American job structure, on the cost of consumer goods, also on the demographic makeup, the politics and culture of the United States, on the financial system, and the development of the financial sector, on inequality in the United States, on the process of globalization in the world, and on trade in the international system. But despite this massive impact of U.S. trade policy and trade agreements on its domestic economy, there still seems to be no realization in Congress that the U.S. capability to implement and manage effective trade policy consistent with public policy is woefully inadequate, concentrated as it is in the Office of the Special Trade by Representative, with its relatively small staff of 200 professionals whose orientation is mainly to monitor barriers to U.S. products in violation of free trade agreements and in understaffed congressional committees. Since trade policy has created widespread discontent, the need has grown for evaluations that go beyond looking at trade barriers and that also evaluate the impacts of continuous departments from balanced trade and the various types of fair trade. The Office of the STR, that's the Special Trade Representative again, avoids that kind of analysis. however. And the next section deals with impact assessment for trade policy, question mark. Neither fair trade nor trade for public purpose policies are as easy to evaluate on the surface as free trade or balanced trade. So if either were adopted as the overall trade policy orientation of the United States, then that avoidance of comprehensive impact analysis for trade policy would have to change. Both the STR and congressional staff would need to model periodically, also assess and evaluate the impact of changes in either one of these types of policies on either trade fairness or public purpose, as the case may be. With free trade or balanced trade, one can pretend it is not one's job to evaluate any aspect of impact, except for progress towards eliminating trade barriers and or the departure from balanced trade involving various products and various nations. But with fair trade and trade for public purpose, there's no way to avoid incorporating multidimensional, see the list of 32 dimensions of public purpose policy intentions in the last chapter. There's no way to avoid incorporating multidimensional assessment of impact across many nations and products, and including normative prioritizations, distinguishing dimensions for their relative importance in contributing to fairness or to net benefits, but relative to public purpose, unquote, as the case may be. So the need to perform such complex evaluations implies a need for large-scale models based on carefully constructed methodologies to perform the needed impact assessments, prioritizations of dimensions, and pair comparisons of cases over time. Actually, the need to do that kind of evaluation was always there when one considers that the multidimensional assessments and valuations, had they been done previously, would have long ago illuminated the side effects of the free trade policies we've been following. However, there was never any incentive to take on such assessments and evaluations, since they were likely to show that the STR's devotion to unrestricted free trade ideology in trade agreements was damaging to the United States. The next section is on an Office of Trade Impact Assessment for Trade Policy. In order for the Office of the STR to perform the kinds of assessments and evaluations described just above, the STR would need to expand to take on a much more sophisticated and larger technical staff than it has now. In addition, that staff would need to develop a capability for evaluations of policy impact exceeding that of the Congressional Budget Office, because it would have to concern itself with a broad range of social, economic, environmental, and climate sustainability and cultural indicators in order to do its job. In addition, for Congress to understand what the expanded STR staff was doing, it would have to create a much broader analytical capability itself than it has today. In fact, I propose that Congress establish a new Office of Trade Impact Assessment, that is an OTIA, for trade policy within Congress itself, tasked with the job of supporting trade policy creation, assessment, and evaluation, so it is capable of evaluating the trade policy proposals generated by the STR and the executive branch of government. Congress needs an OTIA to strengthen its hand in actually negotiating trade agreements or in assessing and evaluating them, so it can play its proper role in contributing to those agreements. In the last 35 years, the congressional role in trade policy has been growing smaller I believe that the constitutional balance between the Congress and the executive branch has been disturbed over the last generation, and that Congress, until very recently, has become little more than a distant counselor at the president's elbow after a deal is done. But contrary to its constitutionally prescribed role, it has had only a very, very small role in actually negotiating trade agreements. And my conclusion, this brings us to the core issue. I think Congress needs to restore its role in the trade process and ensure that it has more than a vote up or down in in trade negotiations, but can be a participant at every stage of the negotiation process. After all, if the executive branch can bring in representatives of large multinational corporations at every stage of the negotiation process, it certainly should be required to accord the same access to the people's by representatives in Congress. To make that happen, I think Congress should treat trade in a manner similar to the way it treats environmental policy. The STR should be required to file a trade agreement impact statement, that is a TAIS or TIAS, before any trade agreement is presented to Congress. And Congress should have at least 90 days for its own staff in the proposed new OTIA to evaluate it and file its own TAIS for Congress to consider. At that point, congressional committees should have at least 30 days to evaluate both TISs before proceeding to consider the new proposed trade agreement under regular order with fast track prohibited. I should explain here, fast but track authority is a device that has been used in recent years to basically have Congress vote itself out of the process of negotiating trade agreements. In other words, it grants to the president, okay, or to the executive, the authority to come up with an agreement with foreign countries which has the status of an executive agreement, and then submit that agreement to Congress for its approval based on an up or down vote with no amendments allowed. I think, though, that fast-track authority should never be granted to the executive branch in the trade agreement area. By representatives and senators have an obligation to the constituents they serve to force a careful evaluation of agreements like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP, what the hell is it called again? The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, before they make it to the floor of either house. And once they do, then there ought to be full debate. These comprehensive agreements are very, very important. They impact hundreds of millions of people. Due to restrictions placed on national sovereignty in the ISDS clauses of the agreements, the investor-state dispute settlement clauses of the agreements, they can affect the financial systems, federal systems, even constitutions of the signatories to these agreements. The president is unwilling to submit these agreements to Congress as treaties, but elects to seek congressional executive agreements to enshrine them into law. These are much more difficult than other laws to repeal because of the involvement of many other nations. Very well. If that's the case, then the executive branch must expect and should only get the very thorough evaluation of these treaties before they are ratified. They need to be evaluated not only for their economic impact, or whether they conform to free trade principles, but also for their political and constitutional impact, so that everyone has plenty of opportunity to understand their implications for current and possible future legislation and for the Constitution itself. It is Congress's duty to treat the agreements that way since its members too are sworn to uphold our laws and the Constitution. But of course, Congress doesn't treat things in this way, and therefore it's abdicated what I think is its constitutional role. It is now time to move away from trade policy and shift to a consideration of fiscal policy and the mutual implications that both fiscal and trade policy have for one another. We will see that the present practice of considering trade and fiscal policies in isolation is irrational and partly accounts for the outcome that both have failed to contribute to public purpose for decades. Which brings me to the next chapter, balanced budget fiscal policy. My analysis of fiscal policy in the remaining chapters will be greatly helped by the following discussion of sector financial balances. Now, you may remember when we went through Stephanie's book, we went through sector financial balances there. Here I say this is a subject that is a must learn for any candidate or office holder who will need to deal with economic issues during their tenure in office, but which very few of them, if any, seem to know anything about. I mean, maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knows something about it now. I suspect that she does, and maybe some others in the squad as well. Anyway, sectoral financial balances. The sector financial balances Sfb model is an accounting identity, and these are always true by definition alone. So if you look at accurate data describing some past time period, you will and must always find that the Sfb model fits the data within the limits of measurement error. But the identity can also be used to generate hypotheses about what will happen to the economy as a whole and even parts of it under certain assumed initial conditions. And that use is very important in anticipating what may happen in the future. We'll see how this works presently. But first, the Sfb model, a very simple one-equation model, says that the domestic private balance over a period of time, in other words, whether the dollar trades the private sector is doing with the other two sectors, whether those trades actually net to a positive balance and how large a positive balance, or whether they net to a negative balance, which of course would mean that the private sector would be running a deficit, would be losing money. Plus, to go on with the equation, the domestic government balance plus the foreign sector balance is equal to zero. In other words, the net of the flow of dollars going from sector to sector among these three sectors is going to be equal to zero. Now that has to be the case because over any period of time, there is a finite flow of dollars within the system. And one sector's gain is bound to be a loss to another sector. And so the flows from one sector to another have to balance out over any given period of time to zero. The terms here refer to balances of flows of net financial assets among the three sectors of the economy in any specified period of time. Why must there be flows? Because each sector sends and receives financial assets such as tax payments, fees, but revenue for goods and services sold, securities bought and sold, loan proceeds, loan repayments, transfer payments, and other payments to other sectors. So the equation says that the sum of all the balances of flows for the three sectors of the economy is zero, because since there's only so much in assets traded in any time period, the positive balances of one or more sectors compared to the others must be matched by the negative balances of the combination of the other two sectors. For example, when the annual domestic private sector balance is positive, then more financial assets are flowing to that sector taken as a whole than it is sending to the other two sectors. Since it is likely that people within the private sector would like to save money or add to their securities holdings every year, and in this way add to their net financial assets, since it is also likely that if the private sector as a whole saves net financial assets, then other things being equal, it will be easier for them to add to their individual or corporate savings as well. And we can also reasonably expect that people will want the government to adopt and accommodate a fiscal stance, ensuring that the domestic private sector will be able to add to its net financial assets, that is, have a positive sector balance each year. Similarly, when the annual foreign sector balance is positive, more financial assets are being sent to that sector from the other two sectors than it is sending to them. So if that happens, then either the government sector or the domestic private sector or both will be losing net financial assets to the foreign sector. That is what happens when we have a trade deficit. And the reaction is that we don't like that loss of net financial assets to the foreign sector. On the other hand, we do like the gains in real non-financial assets that we get from the foreign sector when we have a trade deficit. So on the personal level, most people will prefer a government fiscal stance and policy that both facilitates their ability to save and also facilitates their ability to acquire real products and wealth at prices lower than they would otherwise have had to pay, as long as such a fiscal stance is sustainable, of course. When the annual government sector balance is positive, when it runs a surplus, then it is getting more in financial assets from the other two sectors combined than it is sending to them. So while we can say superficially that it is adding to its net financial assets, it is also subtracting from net dollar-denominated financial assets in at least one and perhaps both of the other two sectors. Also, however, before we conclude that when government has a positive balance, it is adding to its net financial assets, we have to keep in mind the following line of reason. The U.S. and quite a few other governments around the world are monetarily sovereign governments. As I've explained earlier, such governments have the capability to generate unlimited net financial assets at will, not without consequences, since if they generate too much and then spend it into the economy, it will cause demand pull inflation and price stability will be lost. However, that possibility doesn't affect the question of whether the government adds to its net financial assets when it runs a positive sector balance, commonly called the budget surplus. That's because the government's capability to generate new financial assets at will has to be viewed as a financial asset itself. So what is that capability worth? Obviously, it has an infinite domestic financial value because it can be used to pay for whatever is for sale in the United States that the federal government has to or wants to pay for in dollars. But if an entity already has an infinite capacity to create financial assets, then how can it add to its already infinite net financial assets by adding payments to those net financial assets? The answer, in my view, is that it can't, except in a very Pickwickian sense, since how can you add to an infinitely valuable set of net financial assets? So the important thing about a U.S. government budget surplus isn't that it adds to the government stock of net financial assets. It is that it destroys net dollar-denominated assets in either one or both of the other sectors, either in the private sector or the foreign sector, within a particular time period, since it reduces their net financial assets through taxation, tariffs, or export transactions. Next, when the domestic private sector balance is negative, that implies that it, the private sector, is sending more to the other two sectors combined than it is getting from them. And the same applies, of course, when one of the other two sectors runs a negative balance. So it's that as background. Let's now look at the model again domestic private balance, but plus the domestic government balance, plus the foreign balance is equal to zero. And also, at some hypotheses one can generate using the model, along with some what-ifs. Suppose, for example, that we have a government that is cutting spending, raising taxes, or both, because it wants to have a surplus of 2% of GDP in some annual period in order to prove to people that it is fiscally responsible. And suppose also that the same government believes in free trade and makes no effort to restrict imports, so that import levels stay about the same as in the previous year, let's say 2.5% of GDP. Then the sectoral financial balances identity leads us to predict that the private sector will have a negative balance of 4.5% of GDP, because we have plus 2.5% for the foreign sector, plus 2.0% for the government sector. And that implies that if the identity is going to equal zero after the fact, then the private sector will have to experience that negative balance of 4.5% of GDP. Now, it just so happens that the United States is a nation whose foreign sector has been running a surplus of about 2.5% over the past few years. Now, that was as of 2015, because that's when I wrote the book. I haven't actually checked what the sectoral financial balances have said in recent years. I really should. There's no excuse for me not to have done that. That may continue this year, but for some years before the crash of 2008, the foreign sector balance got as high as 6.5% of GDP and frequently ranged between 4.5% and 6.5% of GDP for 6 years before that. The general pattern was that during the years of the housing boom, the foreign surplus was in that higher range. And when the housing market was slow, it was down around that 2.5% figure, implying that it's a pretty good bet that the foreign sector will probably run a surplus of at least 2.5% of GDP for the next few years, given a stagnant economy here, unless there is a great disturbance in patterns of foreign trade. So assuming that 2.5% foreign sector surplus, what would the U.S. government have to do to ensure that the domestic private sector wasn't getting poorer? Well, the identity tells us that we'd have to run a budget deficit of at least 2.5% of GDP just for the private sector to stay even. Let's say now that the private sector wanted to have a surplus of 5% of GDP so it could get richer. Then the identity tells us that the government would have to run a budget deficit of 7.5% of GDP to make that happen. Given a GDP of 17.4 trillion, that means it would have to run a deficit of roughly 1.3 trillion to fulfill that savings desire. So that's what I said in 2015 when GDP was about 17.4 trillion. So what kind of budget deficit contribution to the two non-government sectors is the government making now? Well, CBO's most current projection for fiscal 2015, as of August 25th of 2015, okay, I'm laughing because it's giving a projection for fiscal 2015, and it's about a month away from 2015 being over. Okay, so the projection, I mean, big deal, right? So the projection is $426 billion, a far cry from that $1.3 trillion budget deficit it ought to be running. Okay, that was when Obama was president, of course, and it needed another 900 billion to get to the 1,300 billion, $1.3 trillion budget deficit ought to be running, and just about the same size as the projected foreign sector surplus. Private sector aggregate savings then are currently projected to come out at very close to zero for fiscal 2015, based on the federal deficit alone. So Obama, in the next to last year of his tenure as President of the United States, had reached a point where he wasn't producing any aggregate savings for the private sector. His economy wasn't producing any aggregate savings for the private sector. Okay, I mean, there was enough happening to cover the trade deficit, yes, but that's all it was. It couldn't go any farther. However, in addition to the federal deficit, one also needs to take into account state and local government deficits to get the full picture necessary for the government sectoral balance. In recent quarters, the state and local share has been about 1% of GDP, or about 174 billion added to the government sector deficit. This brings us up to 600 billion and to about a 1% aggregate surplus for the private sector balance. Still nowhere near the 1.3 trillion we needed to offset the potential demand loss from savings desires in the foreign sector balance. I say potential here because if the money isn't there for the private sector to save its desired 5%, then it won't have that surplus. But as I just said, we'll only have a 1% surplus. That doesn't mean no one will save in the private sector. There are many individuals and corporations would save and grow more prosperous, and did save and grow more prosperous in the event. But many will lose ground, I say. But the identity does tell us, especially with the increasing tendency of new income to rise to the top end of the economic hierarchy, that it will be that much harder for things to get better for the great mass of people at the lower end of the economy than it has been since 2009. And it also suggests that without a credit bubble forming, we will not be having a dynamic growing economy anytime soon. Now, how can it happen that you'd have a growing economy due to a credit bubble? Because the credit bubble adds money to the economy, but through the banks. The money that's added is not added as a net financial assets, but as debt. But that doesn't stop people from spending the money created by the banks into the economy, and therefore getting a dynamic and growing economy. But note, it wouldn't have been one in terms of growing net financial assets in the economy, and therefore it wouldn't have been sustainable, and therefore at some point it would eventually have collapsed. Question: what is balanced budget fiscal policy? Balanced budget fiscal policy is a policy that aims to reduce deficits over time with the goal of getting to and more or less maintaining a balanced budget indefinitely. In the U.S., current political systems today, our state governors, mayors, and local government executives pursue such a policy most or all the time, with some exceptions. In most cases, these executives must pursue such a policy because it is mandated in state constitutions or is a condition that states try to enforce on city governments. Nevertheless, in spite of requirements forbidding states to run deficits, they still do, to the extent that in the aggregate, state and local governments may total anywhere from 0.5% to nearly 2% of GDP annually. The aggregate of state and local deficits is added to the federal deficit to compute the government balance in the United States. So state expenditures do add to aggregate demand in the short run. However, when states run deficits, they can only do so by borrowing money without issuing any money to match what they borrow. So state deficits do have to be paid back through revenue gained from other sources, often from surpluses run by the state. If those surpluses result from increased taxation of those with high propensities to consume, then that will have a deflationary effect on a state or local economy, and by extension on the GDP of the United States as well. Moving back to the federal level, one can see from the previous discussion of sectoral balances that assuming a trade deficit, that is a foreign sector surplus, A continuous policy of balancing the budget would result in a continuous withdrawal of tax revenues, that is, money from the domestic private sector, and the more successful the policy is, the more such net financial assets would be drained from the private sector. Over a period of years, even just a few, that would produce a pronounced tendency to cause a recession, perhaps a very serious one. However, when such a recession would occur is hard to predict because bank money created along with interest-bearing debts can put financial assets matched by their debts in consumers' hands they can use to consume, as we saw during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and to some extent even more recently. But debt finance consumption cannot create new net financial assets other than on paper. For that to happen, the Treasury has to create new net financial assets, government debt, through the process of deficit spending. Fortunately, a continuous policy seeking a budget surplus or severe deficit by reduction is not easily implemented in a modern fiat money-driven economy with a strong social safety net. That's due to the effect of the automatic stabilizers built into such programs. Unemployment insurance payments, welfare programs, employment training programs, disability programs, early retirements, and other safety net measures, when activated, work against the government's deficit reduction or balanced budget policy and can prevent the worst effects of budgetary austerity as they have in recent years. In addition, the reduction in tax revenue resulting from a recession itself reduces the revenues of government and tends to maintain the government deficit and its positive effect on the economy. Nevertheless, if a government is determined to make a balanced budget policy work in the presence of a trade deficit, it can do that by crushing the automatic stabilizers, as the Republicans seem quite frequently to be trying to do. We don't have to look too far to see what happens when we have determined governments who won't or can't take no for an answer when it comes to greatly reducing or eliminating the budget deficit. All we have to do indeed is to look to the Eurozone nations who run trade deficits with Germany and other successful exporting nations and who have been forced by the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, that is, to move towards balanced budgets after the crash very quickly. There we see that in nations like Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, also referred to as the PIGS nations, the result of budgetary austerity has been high unemployment reaching Great Depression levels, especially among young people, increasing rates of family breakup, increasing suicide rates, breakdowns of public health systems, and increases in the death rate. In the Eurozone and in such nations as Russia during the 1990s, and in Eurozone the wannabes of the Eurozone, such as the Baltic nations and Hungary, we have seen that in a literal sense, the budgetary austerity that kills. And there's a reference there to a book called The Body Economic, which is all about the worst health effects that were caused by austerity in Europe, not only in response to the crash of 2008, but earlier austerity, such as was visited in Russia during the 1990s. That's a wonderful book. I urge that you read it. Finally, it is worthwhile to note that since the stimulus by legislation in 2009, the policy of the Obama administration, has been to cut federal spending gradually to bring the U.S. closer to a balanced budget and to accomplish steady deficit reduction without much regard for the economic context. The president seems, since early in 2010, if not before, to be bent on following President Clinton's pattern of reducing the deficit gradually while using the slower recovery to work towards a surplus. President Obama has even had President Clinton's surplus, the creators, Peter Orszag and Jack Lew, working for him in order to hold down federal spending. So the president has been following a balanced budget, seeking fiscal policy with overtones of approaching austerity, not too different from what Paul Ryan has been advocating. Mr. Obama's course has been more moderate than Mr. Ryan's proposals, but still, he has never ceased tightening the screws on deficit spending, and he seems to celebrate each report of progress to the balanced budget, not seeming to realize that this course and its success is not news. It is deflationary and prolongs the full recovery from the crash of 2008. And you will remember that from Stephanie's book, that if there's a surplus in government, then that comes out of the pockets of the non-government. And in the three-category model, if there's a surplus in government, and that is coupled with a trade deficit, then the effect over time is to take away substantial net financial assets from the private sector, which is what happened during the latter part of the Clinton period, causing a recession between the years 2000 and 2002, and the effects of that recession also hung over and contributed to the Great Recession of 2008. Now, if balanced budget fiscal policy worked, before the rise of unbacked fiat money during the 1970s, government spending was constrained by gold reserves because its paper money and reserves were convertible to gold on demand, and governments were forced to constrain their money creation to some guessed at safe ratio of gold reserves to issued money. But in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window of the United States to short-circuit a run on gold reserves by France, and declared that U.S. currency and reserves would not be convertible to any other commodity or currency. During the gold standard period, however, the government of the United States and the governments of other nations as well did not have much choice but to try to pursue a budget balance, or at least a deficit neutral in the long run policy, whether the government was run by liberals or conservatives. The liberals were more inclined to run deficits than conservatives, and to enact higher taxes and borrow more to pay for more activist and redistributionist the government than conservatives. But generally, until the New Deal, all U.S. governments were pretty fiscally conservative. The way conservatives saw it, that kind of system worked very well. The United States relied on the private banks and foreign and domestic capital to grow and to create a prosperous industrial power. The periodic depressions and booms, the repressions of labor, the growing inequality in American society, culminating in the 1920s, were all just part of the system, and a price well worth paying in return for the growth and expansion that industrial capitalism actually promoted through government facilitations and subsidies for business, and supported by an ideology of market fundamentalism and small, non-intrusive, balanced, budget-oriented the government had brought. Conservatives in both major political parties thought this was a great system, and by the end of the 1920s were prepared to continue that system far into the future. They were, however, derailed by the Depression of the 1930s, by Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal and World War II, all of which disturbed the basic pattern of American society. It appeared up to the 1970s to be a permanent change, but gradually through the 1970s and accelerating during the 1980s and afterwards, a conservative form of market fundamentalism fueled by private money and by the ideology, of neoliberalism has returned. And with it has come a militant advocacy of market fundamentalism and deficit reduction through shrinking federal spending and working towards a balanced budget. Partisans of these views, such as the Koch brothers and their creatures, such as Paul Ryan and most Republicans in Congress, happen to militantly advocate a return to the balanced budget system as it existed under the gold standard. And while they insist on shrinking government spending, they also insist on refusing to raise taxes, so that their balanced budget program becomes one of taking government facilitations from most people while insisting that the advantages the very rich get from the existing system both remain in place and are extended. And that is the way their balanced budget system would work in the face of continuing trade deficits. Here are some balanced budget fiscal policy problems. The balanced budget policy regime in the United States retreated at the national level because the New Deal dared to run deficits that were moderate during the 1930s, ranging from a low of 0.1% of GDP to a high of 5.8%, while averaging 3.3% from 1933 to 1941, and spent the deficit money on programs that produced enduring value for people. This was done without solvency repercussions because first FDR closed the gold window and made the dollar non-convertible for domestic holders of U.S. currency. So the need to support gold conversions only applied to the international market. Second, during this period, the U.S. ran trade surpluses nearly every year, giving the government more room to run trade deficits. And third, during the war years, gold convertibility wasn't an issue because no nation was allowed to create a run on gold reserves in the international market during those years, and no nation was capable of doing so during the post-war period. The biggest story of the Roosevelt years that broke the sacredness of the old-time religion that was mandating that we balance budgets was provided by the huge deficits FDR's government ran during the war years. They were in the neighborhood of 14% to nearly 30% during the years 1942 to 1944. Unprecedented on the before or since, except for Truman's 1945 budget, which was inherited from FDR. Of course, the World War II budgets created full employment and led to a great post-war boom while creating no solvency problems. So the FDR experience eroded the strength of the political support for balanced budgets, though some of it still remained. It is quite true that once the war was over, Truman was back to surpluses by 1947 and ran consistent surpluses with the exception of 1950 and 52, when small deficits occurred in wartime. Other presidents after Truman also tried to balance budgets too, but I think it is fair to say that all of them placed a priority on full employment over balanced budgets. Until the 1970s, when the supply push oil-based inflation frightened people and reordered the political priorities of politicians, leading to the current comeback of deficit reductionism with the goal of a balanced budget in the decades since. As time has passed, however, the new orientation, putting market fundamentalism and a renewed drive towards actually balancing the budget front and center, has created discontent as people have become aware that the new neoliberal economy has resulted in the highest levels of inequality in the United States since FDR's revolution. Increasingly visible discontent with the new order and the inequalities it has created signal that people no longer believe that the neoliberal economic order is working for them, and that its nostrums, including budget balancing and deficit reduction, are not for them. They were distracted for a while by housing booms and unreal gains in property values that allowed very many middle-class people to profit handsomely by selling out and retiring to warmer climes with cheaper living costs that allowed many others to believe that they had become comfortable due to the inflated market values of their homes. But the crash of 2008 provided the proverbial rude awakening for many, with people losing paper values of 40 to 60% off the asset side of their balance sheets in a very short period, while still getting stuck with credit card debts from loans extended to them based on the old paper values of their houses. But many are still faced with student loan debts whose repayment can't be covered by the disappearance of the highly paid jobs they hope to find upon graduation. So they too are ready and anxious for major changes in an economic system that is not working for them. Indeed, I think people are ready to be convinced that what they were taught about balanced budgets and the government budget being just like a very big household budget doesn't and won't work for them, the household myth. And that there is another way of looking at budgeting and fiscal policy that will work better. There are two candidates to replace the newest revision of the old-time religion that has been bedeviling the world's recovery from the Great Crash. One of these is the idea most have derived from Keynes, that balancing the budget annually or making an attempt to do so is unwise and will prevent a full recovery. Instead, these Keynesians believe that deficit spending can be used freely to bring the economy out of its down cycle, but that deficit reduction must then occur to prevent inflation, so that the general rule should be something like deficit neutrality in the long-run fiscal policy. The other candidate is the idea that fiscal policy should always consider a broader context than the fiscal balance for monetary sovereigns such as the United States. That larger context must, at a minimum, be based on assumptions about the trade balance the private sector needs or wants, and the savings it needs or wants, or really its people need or want. And also on the still broader context of the public purpose of the nation in reaching certain societal purposes specified in views about the dimensions of public purpose of the kind I offered earlier in the chapter on trade policy for public purpose. I'll cover these two alternatives in the next two chapters. So there we go. I think I've done enough for tonight, and that I'm going to take a look at your questions and save the next two chapters. Let me look here. Save the next two chapters. For next time. No, I guess I will go a little further. It would be nice to finish this part and go to the concluding parts of the book for next time. So let's see. These are fairly short chapters. We might be able to get through them in good order tonight. So deficit neutrality in the long-run fiscal policy. The Keynesian view that deficit spending is the right thing to do during a down cycle has been popular in democratic and progressive circles for a long time. And most progressives subscribe to it, including economists such as Paul Krugman, Robert Reich, Jared Bernstein, Brad DeLong, and Christina Romer. Let's examine this policy orientation in more detail. What is deficit neutrality in the long-run fiscal policy? First, the basic idea is to use deficits countercyclically. Deficit spend is necessary to recover from recessions and create full employment, and cut back on deficit spending when the recession begins to end before inflation pressures build up in the economy from excessive demand. Over the long run, they think fiscal policy should be neutral, and deficits and surpluses will even out, bringing the long-run fiscal balance close to zero. Second, they want a deficit spend on programs that will have a high fiscal multiplier. So if tax cuts are involved, one should make sure the tax cuts are targeted at segments of the population that will spend rather than save money, something Donald Trump did not do in his tax cuts, so that the tax cuts have the maximum expansionary impact on the economy possible. And again, I'll add here, since Trump did not do that, his tax policies, his tax cuts did not have the maximum expansionary impact. How do we know? Well, because most people were not better off as a result of the tax cuts and in the expansionary effect it had on the economy. It did have a bit of an expansionary impact. It kept things going to where the U3 unemployment rate was lower, but as we know, there was a lot of hidden unemployment, and there was also an economy in which wages were not rising very rapidly for most of the people. Anyway, third, they want to deficit spend in such a way that the spending not only facilitates economic growth, but also reduces inequality by getting more money into the hands of the needy. That will be more effective anyway, they believe, because it will take advantage of the highest fiscal multipliers. Fourth, they want a deficit spend on programs and projects that make an investment in the economy and will continue to, quote, pay dividends, unquote, for a long time in the future. Infrastructure spending is a paradigmatic type of investment. Education is another, and research and development is another. Fifth, economists in this group are perhaps divided when it comes to direct job creation by the federal government. Some prefer deficit spending stimulate the private sector to create new jobs, rather than to have the government sector do it. Others, such as Reich, may support direct government job creation, but generally do not support the idea that there is a right to a job at a living wage, that the government should offer a federally funded job guarantee, but create jobs instead through New Deal-style projects. Fifth, Keynesians are very wary of the possibility of inflation, and it's occurring at the same time as stagnation. Their experience during the Nixon and Carter administrations, when they were the dominant school in the area of macroeconomics, and when inflation presented itself at the same time as recession, an occurrence unexpected, but from the viewpoint of Keynesian theory, led to the inflation wariness, which continues to inform them today. They still seem to believe that the stagflation of that time was due to government spending getting out of line, as well as to the oil price rises instituted by OPEC and later by the Saudis, who had become the price leader in the oil patch. They think the inflation was broken by Paul Volcker, who killed consumer demand by shutting down the lending. So they seem to believe that the inflation of the late 70s and early 80s was due to demand pull rather than cost push influences that were initiated by the Saudis. and exacerbated by the Fed itself when it pushed interest rates up to more than 20%. Sixth, consistent with long-run deficit neutrality, Keynesians are opposed to running continuous deficits year after year. They believe there is no need for this, and that is even harmful because it increases the chances that inflation or hyperinflation may occur. Yeah, Paul Krugman's famous the loanable funds model, he calls it. It's a very, very simple model. The only problem is there's no loanable funds market, so the loanable funds model can't work. And they also believe that the government can cut deficits without harm and reduce the risk of inflation besides if they actively pursue deficit reduction once a recession ends. Seventh, Keynesians appears to believe that the bond markets have a great influence over the rates of interest the government pays on its bonds, and that there is too much deficit spending, and the markets may rebel and drive interest rates on our bonds up, contributing to an inflationary spiral and imposing a heavy burden of repayment on the government. Related to this belief is another related to the danger that too much deficit spending will initiate inflation. Specifically, they believe as deficit spending brings the economy closer to full employment, bubbles will occur in which certain industries, certain segments of the labor market will reach saturation before other segments. This in turn will create some localized episodes of demand pull inflation that can unbalance the economy and create an increased risk of generalized inflation occurring. They also believe that there is a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, below which, that of course is the NIRU again, below which such bubbles occur, and that this rate is the measure of full employment that will ensure against us spending too much and initiating a damaging inflationary process. Eighth, nevertheless, Keynesians do not think it is good for a fiat sovereign to deficit spend in the private sector without issuing a corresponding amount of debt. They seem to believe that creating money without debt would be more inflationary than creating money along with issuing debt in a corresponding amount. They apparently think that when money is locked up in bonds or securities, then the people who own it cannot get access to their money without actually selling their bonds first and getting the liquidity of their reserves. Ninth, Keynesians also seem to hold that while the level of debt isn't per se a problem for fiat sovereign governments, when it comes to solvency, the debt to GDP ratio is. So after a period of raising the debt to GDP ratio after a recession, that number must be quickly reduced through fiscal policy producing deficits smaller than the rate of growth of GDP or running surpluses so that the debt to GDP ratio is reduced. Lest the bond markets decide that the government having a high debt to GDP ratio that it refuses to reduce is a poor credit risk, and so they then decide to stop lending to it, or alternatively only lend to it at higher interest rates than normal. So these considerations imply that the Keynesians have committed to the existence of a government budget constraint, a GBC, that stops them from running deficits, as long as deficits may be needed to keep the economy on an even keel. 10th, the Keynesians also believe that a fiat sovereign's capability deficit spend is therefore affected by its debt to GDP ratio. The higher the debt to GDP ratio, the more likely it is that the markets will cut governments off, making it impossible for them to continue deficit spending. On 11th, for all the above reasons, the Keynesians share with the balanced budget Austerians the idea that the impact of a budget on deficits and the national debt is an evaluation criterion for a budget that is prior to any others. While they generally favor types of government spending and deficit spending that are much more progressive than the Austerians, the fact that they place deficit/debt considerations on a similar pedestal to the one used by the budget balancers is important, because when a policy measure is proposed, almost the first question that will be asked is, quote, how are we going to pay for it, unquote? And then, quote, what will we have to give up to get it, unquote? So this immediately gets them into a negotiation posture with the budget balancers, and then coming away from the grand bargains they make with less than they believe is really needed to solve serious problems. I'm sorry, folks, it's the fire engines. In fact, their attitude towards budgeting has a bit of a moral tinge to it, implying for some that we can commit the sin of deficit spending, because that sin is justified by the good outcome of economic recovery we can expect from it, but also that after engaging in such excess, then we must expiate our sin by immediately reining in our profligate spending, which is in principle a bad thing, in order to avoid the punishment of demand pull inflation, which is sure to follow if we do not morally tighten the government spending belt and try to make do on our own with much less government sector help, if any, to work with. So what if deficit neutrality in long-run fiscal policy worked? Well, if deficit neutrality in the long-run fiscal policy worked, then we would have greater stability of the economy than we have now, with steadier and more rapid growth. And they believe that this fiscal policy would help us to avoid severe economic downturns and the long-term growth of debt, which we would pay down during the times when the government would be running a surplus. But of course, we would still have cycles, still have some inflation, and still have bond markets to discipline the profligate governments. Most importantly, we would still have the Fed and central bank independence to help to protect us from inflation caused by those profligate governments. And we would still have the kind of monetary policy run competently by independent technocrats that we would rely on to dampen down inflation if government spending causes overstimulation of the economy. So what are the costs of deficit neutrality in the long run fiscal policy? Well, the primary problem with it is that the government doesn't work in such a way that following such a policy will avoid the worst of recessions and unemployment while moderating the frequency of downturns. That is to say, that policy just doesn't work. The reason why is that the Keynesian vision that it is cycles, deficits, and debt to GDP ratios that have to be managed, and moderated, rather than public purpose, unemployment, and price stability directly, selects the wrong targets of concern for fiscal policy. The real targets of importance are the dimensions of public purpose that people care about. They are not indicators such as the size of deficits or debt to GDP ratios that are not very important to fiat sovereigns running trade deficits. As for the cycles themselves, if they were defined by the Keynesians in terms of valid measures of actual full employment, based on the idea that we have full employment when everyone who wants a job, either full-time or part-time, can get one, then that would be one thing. But if they are defined as they are now in terms of cycles based on the idea that economic growth as measured by GDP is the end goal, then why would they be important for public purpose, quote unquote? And why would we view the ebb and flow of such cycles as indicators that we ought to care about and whose value we ought to manage? Turning points in GDP are supposed to be closely coupled to turns in the labor market, but increasingly in nations where the financialized economy diverges from the real economy, we have the ends of technical recessions occurring long before the labor market recovers from a downturn, if it ever does before the next recession occurs. So I think we need more immediate indicators than that to evaluate whether fiscal policy is acceptable or not, and whether and when recessions are beginning and ending. As for myself, the continued existence of a shrunken labor force and a higher rate of real unemployment at the same time signals that this economy has never fully recovered from the Great Recession, and the long-run deficit neutrality orientation using cycle indicators based on GDP is telling the Keynesians the wrong thing. What it is telling them is that it is time to back off expansionary fiscal policy after so many months of slow expansion, start to worry about cutting deficit and debts again, while it is telling me that Keynesian long-run deficit neutrality fiscal policy has failed and it is leaving the job undone because it is guided by fears of inflation, the Nairu dodge, and the ideas that you must have government debt instruments to run deficits, and also that you have a government budget constraint that won't allow the government to keep on deficit spending until the job is done, while recognizing the possibility of that, depending on the context, the job might never be done, and one might have to keep on running deficits for the indefinite future to accommodate both private sector savings and trading desires. Conclusion. Indeed, inherent in the long-run deficit neutrality orientation is the possibility that the Keynesians will make things worse by advocating for the winding down of deficit spending, simply based on the theory that they have to do that according to the dictates of Keynesian theory. And if that happens, then they may well recommend policy changes that exacerbate the situation we find in our stagnant economy, based on a theory that says we must manage deficit spending actively as a first priority, rather than managing for achieving public purpose, including full employment, price stability, and other public purpose goals and objectives, and letting the trade deficit and the budget deficit both float. I think that conclusion is a great error and emerges from a point of view that neglects serious consideration of the sectoral financial balances and what they imply for fiscal policy. In the next chapter, I'll present the view that is an error in more detail. But here it's important to note that it completely invalidates the idea of fiscal policy for deficit and neutrality in the long run. So, next is budgeting for public purpose fiscal policy, and I'll hold that off for next time because it's getting late. And once we finish that, we will go, we'll cover what's really needed, specifically a holistic approach to trade and fiscal policy. Then I'll go into a critique of the trade deals that were being considered in 2015, and that under Joe Biden might very well come back to haunt us, because Joe Biden has been a free trader for a long time, and he believed in the TPP, the TISA, and the TTIP, perhaps even to a greater degree than Hillary Clinton did. Now, whether he still believes it or not, I don't know, but I don't like some of the vibes I've been getting from him in that particular respect. Anyway, after we cover that critique, we'll get into the conclusion on who needs balanced trade and who needs balanced budgets. In other words, we'll return to the title and explain why it makes sense, okay, in light of the book. And that's how we're going to finish this off. Okay? So for now, I'm going to turn to your comments. I noticed that I still seem to be looking pretty good. Let's see how I look through the Facebook lens. Not too bad. I guess this camera is working. Okay. So, let me go to your comments now. Deborah says, talk about the New World Order. Steve Wolfbrand says, that's by Deborah Wilson. Talk about the New World Order. And Stephen Wolfbrand says, our Congress seems to have abdicated its responsibility bought off by corporations. Absolutely. Not only our Congress, but its leaders. I would say, I think that perhaps the leaders are even more responsible than Congress as a whole because, well, maybe Congress is if you consider that it's Congress that has created an oligarchy system in the Congress. It didn't have to do that. Kay says, exactly, Steve. And Steve says, Doc should run for POTUS. Well, thank you, but I don't see that anybody is going to vote for an 81-year-old guy for POTUS, especially a poor 81-year-old guy who doesn't have the money to get into the mass media. Steve says, support and donate to Shahid Buttar. That's where our fight lies now, as well as Paul Eugene Swearingen. I completely agree. But also there is Jen Perelman, who's running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And there are some great races, at least 2 districts we have to win, in Washington State. And there are a number of districts in California. There are a number of congressional districts in Texas, which were up for grabs today. I don't know what happened in those districts. We have to see. Steve says the background noise is gone. Yeah, I don't know what was causing it. I thought that I ended long before 9:27. But anyway, Kay says, the Women for a People's Party was going to protest at Pelosi's house, and Shahid Buttar for Congress was going to go along. Did you hear anything about that happening, Steve? The guy that built the Bernie bus, Steve says, has transformed it to the Shahid bus. They're challenging Pelosi to debate, but so far she is by refusing. And by the way, she refused in spite of the fact that they put a cup of Haagen-Dazs on her chair in front of the Shahid bus. She didn't show up for the Haagen-Dazs. So they speculated that the Haagen-Dazs wasn't good enough for her. Kay says, no surprise. She thinks she's entitled to make the rules, SMH. Hope the people out there get rid of her. Oh, I sincerely hope so. I sincerely hope so. And I'll tell you, I even hope that Amy McGrath wins in Kentucky. I can't stand Amy McGrath. I can't stand her. But we really need to get Mitch out of there too. We really need to get him out of there. His successor will be much less powerful. We still don't know whether we're going to take over the Senate. If we do take, I should say if the Democrats take over the Senate, then Mitch is going to have a lot less influence than he has now. And he'll be able to do a lot less damage than he could do now. But at the same time, we can't be sure that he's going to lose control of the Senate. But if he's beaten by Amy McGrath, we can be sure he's going to lose control of the Senate. That's going to be it for him, for his career. Steve says, the Shahid bus had an empty chair with fancy ice cream to get Pelosi to come out. It was Haagen-Dazs and debate. Laugh out loud. They are fighting hard. Laugh out loud. Nice touch on his part. I don't think it was on his part. It was on the Movement for a People's Party part, but he got a kick out of it. Steve says, Doc, I think any trade deal should ensure that people in other countries work safely with a living wage. Otherwise, we race to the bottom. I think so, too. That's why I say that trade for the public purpose, is a very good thing to have. Steve says, Doc, I appreciate your book, but but haven't we entered an entirely different universe due to the COVID-19 pandemic? Aren't all bets off at the moment? Well, I don't think that my book is, we entered an entirely different universe when Trump actually came into the presidency, because he wasn't going to implement a trade for public purpose policy. But I do expect that we'll have a better situation with the COVID-19 pandemic if Trump should lose and Biden takes over the presidency, and a guy by the name of Ron Klain is going to be asked to finish off the virus in the United States. And Ron Klain was extremely successful in containing the Ebola virus and was very decisive in his actions about it. And I think he'll do the same for the coronavirus, as well, for COVID-19. So I think one thing the Biden administration is going to do is going to improve the situation with COVID-19. I'd be very surprised if he does not do that. And Steve is giving us some code for YouTube. I don't know why. He's giving us some iframe code for YouTube. Kay says austerity does kill in many ways. And Deborah says, let's go, I'm nearby. Pelosi caravan, I'd love to see that for sure. Laugh out loud. Bernie has come out supporting Paula Jean. Yes, I know he has. Dr. Cornel West has come out supporting Shahed. I know he has. But I also know that Bernie has not. Unfortunately, the squad and AOC are too afraid Nancy Pelosi to endorse her primary opponents. I know. And I think that's pretty much a scandal. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that the squad, and AOC are going to be coming up against Pelosi in the next Congress anyway. If she wins, they're going to have to come up against her again when it comes to the contest for the speakership. Because to get anything done, they absolutely need her out of there. No ifs, ands, or buts. She cannot be the speaker again. So they're going to have to defy her anyway when the new Congress starts. They might as well start by defying her right now. What do they gain right now by continuing to support her? If Shahed can knock her off, it saves them the fight in 2021. No, they need to go after Pelosi now by endorsing Shahed. It is the wrong calculation to wait. It makes no sense. Now, Bernie is in a different situation. He's in a different situation because he's trying to protect his chairmanship in the Senate. He doesn't want to be too blatant in his support of non-establishment people. He'll do support, of Paula Jean, because only person she's threatening is Joe Manchin. He's not absolutely beloved by the Democratic establishment, I don't think. Not in the way Pelosi is. But he probably doesn't dare to go after Pelosi, because then he might get some retaliation from Schumer. I understand he wants to conserve his chairmanship because it is a source of power that they most probably, once he has the chairmanship, they won't infringe on the prerogatives there, because everybody depends on the prerogatives of the chairs of the committees, and they're careful about infringing on those, even Pelosi and even Schumer. So, but the squad has a different situation, okay, because Pelosi is not supporting them. Usually, in their case, well, for example, okay, in Ilhan Omar's case, there's a challenge to her. And the establishment is supporting the challengers. The establishment is not supporting her. Okay. Also, the establishment tried to get AOC. They failed, but they tried to get her. She didn't have Pelosi's support. She didn't have Pelosi's endorsement in that election. It's time for the squad to come out and to act like the squad and to do their best to pull in Ro Khanna and Jayapal. And Joanne says, Steve Wolfbrandt, outnumbered, not afraid. Kay says, good info, Joe, thank you. Steve says, in my personal life, I pay everything cash, debt-free. That's just me. Kay says, I finally paid off my credit card with part of that stimulus check, so I'm now debt-free, first time in years. Steve says, wonderful. Steve says, fuck Amy McGrath, that was rigged. I agree, Steve. It was rigged. It was rigged. She was lucky to win anyway. She almost got beat anyway. Bonnie says, I may vote for the Green Party now. Yeah, me too. Kay says, I'm thinking about that too, Bonnie. I'm thinking real hard about that about now. But, okay, in some sense, though, I'm not sure we can wait for the vote. I'm not sure we can wait for the vote at all. People are dying while we wait for the vote. There's a big contest coming up during the next 2 weeks. A lot depends on what the Congress turns out at that time. If they don't protect the mortgage holders, the renters, the unemployed, at that point, with the kinds of policies coming out of Jayapal, coming out of the squad, and coming out of also Tlaib's office, okay, the joint bill that she, and Jayapal, have put on the table. Without those things, and without a Medicare for all, at least for the COVID crisis, we won't be getting what we need to ride out this crisis. Now, this is happening over the next 2 weeks. I think there should be street actions, very active and unending street actions, until the Congress produces what we want and what we need. Street actions, visits to homes, extreme pressure. I think everybody who stands to lose something has to be on their feet now, demanding, telling the Congress that we know there is no public finance problem. That does not exist. That their only reason for not giving us what we need is their unwillingness to legislate for the public purpose. and that if they continue to act in that way, we will defeat as many of them as we possibly can in the upcoming election. And we also won't leave the streets in front of their homes until they give us what we need and what it is in their power to legislate. And Dolores says COVID-19 helps those pushing depopulation. Well, not by that much. I mean, even though the number of deaths is huge right now at nearly 140,000 deaths, it's also true that we're unlikely to do much more than double that, okay, for the rest of the year. So we may end up depopulating the country by 240,000 people, but the increase in our population over this year will still have been greater by that decrease than that particular decrease of 240,000. San Francisco is a weird town, says Steve Wolfbrand. Extreme wealth inequality. Our arch rivals. And Dolores says, Bill Gates' father was into eugenics, and so is he. Is that story about Gates' father true? Because I had the impression that when Gates was growing up, he was a pretty liberal guy. And there weren't too many liberals of that time who were into eugenics. Kay says, I don't like Gates anyway. Kay says, I think so too, Joe. The squad needs to make a statement now. More than a statement, they need to go out there and join demonstrations and protests. They need to physically go out and join those protests. Just like Bernie goes out and joins the marches by the unions. For that matter, the unions have to get out there too and support it. We need the NNU to do that at this point. And we need the CWA to do that too. Steve says, Apple tried to get Kashama too. They failed as well. Yeah, Kashama's strong. And Dolores says, I don't care much for Howie, but I do support the Green Party message and will vote for Howie. Steve Wolfbrand says, but we got Bowman. Kay says, I agree, Joe. Protests work when nothing else does. We also got Dana Balter, who won her primary. She needs to be voted in. She's going to be a good one. I don't know if she's going to join the squad, but she's going to be pretty close. Kay says, I agree, Joe. Protests work when nothing else does. But Dana Balter is running in upstate New York, by the way. Steve says, watch Jimmy Dore. We're going to their homes now. Make their lives hell. Steve says, Gates stole the idea from someone else. The guy wound up dying in a bar fight. Whoops. My monitor flicked out. I have no idea why. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, then tomorrow I guess I'm still contemplating whether to do a program on the Unity Task Force. I may do that tomorrow. okay, I may also do the concluding installment of this book on who needs balanced trade, who needs the balanced budget. I hope by now you can see the importance of the idea of integrating trade policy and fiscal policy. Okay, integrating both, okay, around the idea of public purpose. I think that I haven't heard that idea anywhere else. I don't think that it's been put forward by any of the other MMT people other than myself. I find it a compelling idea. I hope that you do too. The integration of MMT policies around MMT-based policies around the idea of public purpose. The task forces were a joke, but Bernie got nothing. Yes, I agree. I've been going through the report of the task force, trying to find something that he got, and thus far, okay, I haven't been able to find anything. So the question is whether I think not being able to find anything is worth a program or not, okay, and when. Or maybe all I need to do is say with Steve, the task forces were a joke, Bernie got nothing, and leave it, okay, at that. But maybe I need to go into the gory details. So we'll just have to see. So thank you again for coming. Any last minute questions or comments? And have a good night, Russ. Take care. Steve says, but Jimmy Dore did a good show on the task forces. Yeah, I saw Jimmy Dore's show on the task forces. I saw the Convo Catchers show on the task forces, okay, as well. I've been watching other shows on the task forces. I don't think I'm going to do anything on the task forces unless I find some stuff that is interesting from the standpoint of possibly considering another direction or a new direction for Biden. But I'm not very hopeful of finding anything like that. I've just about been through everything now. And I mean, I just don't see much. Steve says, good night, Joe and Bonnie. Love you all. Thank you, Steve. We love you too.
Run that green thing across the bottom of your show for donations.
Oh, so Bonnie is saying run the green thing across the bottom of my screen so people know where to donate. But I don't really think that's necessary because all you really have to do is to look at, hang on a second, and let me do this thing here. Because all you really have to do is to look at me sharing the screen again, and you will see you will see the image of the promo for this show, which has the link to my Patreon account. Maybe I'll even do this with it. There, that gives you a little more. You can see it, okay, a little better. So, have a very good night. If we don't vote for Howie, who else is available? Peace and Freedom? I don't know who else is available, but I think there are probably some other people available. And if we don't vote for Howie, we may want to vote for them. We'll be talking about it at some time in the future, I'm sure, because Joe Biden seems less and less palatable as time goes on. As Bonnie says, he seems like a dud. He seems like a big dud. Good night, Dolores. Thanks for your help tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for everything. I'm going to end. I'll see you tomorrow. And Steve says, Bonnie is funny. I know. And she makes me a lot funnier than I normally am, I'll tell you. I owe much of my current sense of humor to Bonnie.
Me too.